Hello, and welcome to my channel. My name is Jonathan Cohn, and today I have a book review of the book Prophecy by Elizabeth Haydon. It is the second book in the Symphony of Ages series. I recently reviewed the first book in this series. It is called Rhapsody. I absolutely loved this book. I thought it was one of the most brilliant books I'd read in a while. I just ate it up, read it super fast. I thought it was brilliant. I gave it like a 9.9 out of 10. I loved this book. But I recognized that it was an incredibly controversial book. And so I basically told everyone on my channel, look, just because I love this does not mean you love it. And knowing most audiences, I think most people won't. I think there's a reason this is not a New York Times best-selling series. It only got into the USA Today list. I think that's because this was so controversial that a lot of people did not want to read it. And book 2 doubles down on the controversy, but this time in all the wrong ways. The themes that she handled in book 1, I really liked. I liked where she went with them. I liked the message she was trying to portray. In book 2, she abandons a lot of those messages for a more contemporary audience. I think she was trying in some ways to change her messaging, and it just didn't work out. However, Elizabeth Haydon is still telling the story that she wants to tell. Book 1 was for certainly a fantasy that had romance elements, that had sexual themes, but it was a fantasy. I would argue book 2, Prophecy, is a romance book that has fantasy themes. The romance is first and foremost in this book. And as a result, it's more painful for mainstream audiences to read because a lot of fantasy audiences, I would assume, are like myself, that we come for the fantasy and the romance is a pleasant add-on. But we don't come for the romance. We come for the fantasy. The romance is a pleasant add-on. And in this series, because she makes the romance first and foremost in this book, it's harder to enjoy it, and it's harder to recommend it to people. I believe that because the way this book resolves, I believe that book 3 will be all fantasy plot heavy, but this one, it mostly like sidesteps the fantasy plot so that it can focus on the romance, which is really frustrating. This book really is about Rhapsody and Ash, and I loved Ash in the first book, and he makes some questionable decisions in this book, but I still really like him. And part of the problem of Rhapsody and Ash is that they have a dynamic where you know more than they do. Ash has a secret about his past, and Rhapsody has a secret about her past, and what they don't know is that their pasts are connected. But you as the audience know exactly what it is, and you know exactly how they connect, and you know the reasons behind it, and you know if only they just tell each other their secrets, they will realize that they are connected, and all their problems will vanish. It's if only they told each other everything from the start of the book would be like 400 pages shorter, and it would have been a much easier read. Instead, Haydon has them conceal that information because they're kind of ashamed of their past, and they also don't want the other person not to like them, and they're afraid that that information about them is what will turn the other person off. And instead, that information is what brings them together. And so it's so frustrating that there's a lack of communication in this book, and I really don't like that in my books. I wish there was more communication between the characters. Likewise, there's a problem in this book with the structure. The first act is a brilliant structure. It works. The first 200 pages really work well. I'd say that even the first 250 pages maybe work well. But once we get into Act 2 and Act 3 are incredibly poorly paced. Act 2 is way too slow. So much of it could be cut out. Act 2 is the romance of Ash and Rhapsody, and there's way too much graphic sexual content between them. And there's too much graphic content regarding another character that's in this book. And Elizabeth Haydon had a reason for it, and it makes sense, but it's just unnecessary to the story, and it's just not pleasant to read, and I'm just like, I want my romance, but I want them to be sappy romances. I do not want to read about the stuff. Like, in book 1, you don't really read about the acts happening. Book 2, you read about the acts. And so it was just frustrating that I thought that Elizabeth Haydon in the first book is making this theme about abstinence, this theme about how romance should happen in a couple. And book 2 sends highly mixed messages. She still has a few of those themes possible, but there's also others, so it's up to interpretation. It's not as clear as book 1 was. So that really makes me frustrated. Also, part 1 has the dragon in it, and I was like, okay, we're going to the dragon's lair, getting this out of the way. Whoo, if that's the first act, what does acts 2 and 3 have? And then there's a little fantasy plot line that happens with Ahmed and Grunther, but for the most part, there's no fantasy plot line. Then you have Act 3, which is really slow at the beginning, and then it just speeds up and dials up to 11, and you're like, okay, we're going, and this thing happens, and all right, this thing happens, and so they have to go after this bad guy. They kill the bad guy, and they resolve that issue, and then they decide this is how we're going to deal with the Fedor, and then they decide to go to this party, and then the more romance stuff happens, and then it slows down again. And so the fast stuff in the middle happens way too fast. The fast stuff should have been slowed down, and the slow stuff that's around it, before and after, should have been sped up faster. And so as a result, it's so unevenly paced as a book. It's so poorly designed. It's not like a Brandon Sanderson book where it's like you could see it building and then the last 150 pages are just breakneck awesomeness. Instead, it's like there's nothing building, and then whoop, we're break at pace, and then nope, nothing's happening for a while. And you don't see the build-up, you just see fluff. And so it gets very frustrating. This is coming across very negative. And I still had an overall positive experience with the book, but I have so many nitpicks that it just frustrates me that I have to talk about them. I still give this book like a 6 out of 10. Like, it's not horrible, and I actually quite like a lot of the scenes. I like a lot of the dialogue moments. Some of the humor is great in this. But when you sideline, what made book 1 so great is the connection between Rhapsody and Grunther, and Rhapsody and Ahmed, and Rhapsody and Ash. Grunther and Ahmed and Joe are basically non-existent in this book except for a few scenes throughout. Instead, it's all about Rhapsody and Ash. And so Rhapsody and Ash is a good dynamic, but when you make the whole book about it, a whole 700-page book about their dynamic, or maybe 600 out of 700 pages about that, it feels so uneven. It's like, hey, give us back what we liked about book 1. So that's how I felt about the book. Also, book 1 felt like she was heavily borrowing from The Wheel of Time, and she was like, you could obviously see the connections. Book 2 really doesn't feel like she was borrowing from Wheel of Time anymore. It feels like she was going on her own. It feels more, this feels more YA fantasy. Like it feels like a YA book that was published as an adult book, whereas this is an adult fantasy book, even though this has more adult content. It's so complicated to discuss, but I think if you've read this, you will understand my meaning. So I still love the first book. I still think the first book is great, but I'm a little sour just a tiny bit because book 2 didn't live up to the hype. I have book 3. I'll read it in the next month or two. I hope that book 3 puts us back, the plot line goes back, the fantasy elements come back, it puts us on a trajectory towards awesomeness. And if it does, I will feel overall good about this series, just knowing that there's a little fluke in book 2. But if book 3 can't write the series, I'm not sure how I'll view the whole Symphony of Ages as a whole. Because when you have just one good book out of many, it's a very bad batting average. So we'll see how book 3 goes. But for book 2, I gave it like a 6 out of 10. It was okay. There were some good moments I liked, but I'm very frustrated with a lot of it, which knocked it down significantly. So that's my review of Prophecy by Elizabeth Haydon. If you've read this book, what did you think? What did you think of all the romance? Did you think it went on for too long? This is coming from someone who loves romance in his novels. I just don't want it to be the only thing in them. So anyway, if you have any thoughts, leave them in the comments section down below. If you intend to read this series, did I scare you off? I hope I didn't. I still think book 1's amazing. But let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. And until next time, I'm Jonathan, and thank you for watching.